The call came in while I was standing at the nurse's station, finishing a chart before the end of my shift. It was late afternoon. The air still had that dry hospital heat in it, and somebody nearby had just opened a cup of burnt coffee. My phone buzzed across the counter, and when I saw the hospital number, I picked it up before the second ring. The doctor told me my grandmother had been taken in by ambulance. Emergency surgery. Severe infection. High risk. She said I needed to come right away. I said I was on my way. Then I called my father. No answer. I called my mother. No answer there either. So I opened our family group text and wrote, "Grandma is in emergency surgery. It's serious. Please come now." Both of them read it almost immediately. Neither one replied. I grabbed my coat, signed out, and headed to the parking lot. It was one of those gray Pennsylvania evenings when the light disappears early and everything looks a little flat. I remember the cold metal of my keys in my hand. I remember the sound my shoes made on the concrete stairs. Mostly, I remember looking at my phone on the passenger seat at every red light. A few minutes into the drive, my father finally texted back. "You're already there. We'll come if she actually dies." I read it once at the light, then again when traffic moved. After that, I set the phone face down. I did not answer him. I just kept driving. At the time, I did not know that 6 days later a pastor would hand me a sealed envelope in the middle of the funeral. I did not know there was already paperwork in motion, or that my grandmother had spent years keeping records I had never seen. All I knew was that she was in surgery, and I was the only one going. I worked at a hospice agency outside Pittsburgh then, and I had been a nurse long enough to recognize the tone people use when they are trying to stay professional around bad news. The surgeon had not wasted words. Bowel perforation, sepsis, age, cardiac strain. I knew exactly what those things meant, which may have been why I moved so calmly. When you work around dying people, calm can look strange from the outside. It is not the absence of feeling. It is just what you do first. I parked in the visitor garage, third level, near a concrete pillar painted with a fading orange stripe. I took a picture of the number out of habit. Then I walked across the enclosed bridge toward the main building. The floor vibrated faintly under every passing cart. Somewhere down the hall, an intercom chimed. The lobby smelled like floor cleaner and winter coats. At the desk, a woman in navy scrubs printed my visitor badge and clipped it to a blue lanyard. "Anyone else coming?" she asked. I heard myself say, "Yes, they're on the way." It was easier than telling the truth. She directed me to the surgical waiting area, a square room with low lights, vinyl chairs, and a vending machine humming against the far wall. A television was mounted in one corner with the volume off. There were maybe 8 other people in the room. A man in work boots stared at the floor. A woman folded and unfolded a tissue in her lap. Someone had left behind the smell of microwaved soup. I chose a chair facing the hallway doors. Then I waited. A little after 6, a nurse came out and told me they had taken my grandmother in. She said it could be several hours. I thanked her and sat back down. I sent another message to my parents. "She's in surgery now. Seen." No reply. Over the next few hours, I kept doing what I always do when things feel unstable. I made notes, times, updates, who said what, when the charge nurse came through, when the surgeon had not come through, when the waiting room clock clicked from 1 hour to the next. It was not emotional, at least not on the surface. It was just order. Around 7:30, I bought coffee from the vending machine because I needed something warm in my hands. The lid was flimsy, and the first sip burned my tongue. I kept holding the cup anyway. An older woman sitting 2 chairs down glanced over and asked, very gently, "Are you here by yourself?" I looked at her for a second. Then I said, "Not for long." She nodded like that was a comfort. The shift changed at 8. Different footsteps in the hallway. Different voices at the desk. A nurse with reading glasses hanging from a cord checked the board, then looked over at me. "Still just you?" she asked. I gave a small nod. "Do you want us to call anyone?" "No," I said. "They know." She held my eyes for a moment, as if she understood more than I had said, and then she moved on. I texted once more. "No news yet. I'm still here." Seen again. Nothing. By then the waiting room had gone quieter. One lamp buzzed softly near the magazines. The television still flashed changing images with no sound. I could see my reflection in the dark window across from me, sitting straight backed, badge still clipped on, coat folded beside my chair. Every so often I would pick up my phone, look at the blank screen, and put it back down. Then I waited. A little before 10, the operating room doors opened and the surgeon walked toward me. She still had on her cap. Her mask was down around her neck, and I knew before she spoke. There is a look people get when they have already said the words in their head once and do not want to say them again. She stopped in front of me and said they had done everything they could. My grandmother had gone into cardiac arrest during the procedure. They were not able to bring her back. I asked if she had been in pain. The doctor said no. She had been fully under anesthesia. She had not suffered. I nodded and thanked her, which felt strange even as I did it. Then I sat back down for a second because my knees had gone light. The waiting room was still. Somewhere behind me, ice dropped into a machine with a hard metallic clatter. A nurse led me to a smaller room off the corridor where they had brought my grandmother afterward. The lights were low in there. The blanket was pulled up neatly. One of her hands was resting outside it, palm turned slightly upward, and I remember how ordinary that looked. Just a hand. Fine skin. Wedding band. The kind of hand that had buttoned my coat when I was little and wrapped leftovers in foil and pressed cash into birthday cards. I sat beside her for a few minutes and said the only things I could think to say. That I was there. That I was sorry. That I would take care of what needed to be taken care of. When I came back out to the hallway, I stood near the elevators and called my father. He answered on the third ring. I told him she had died in surgery. There was a pause, only a few seconds, and then he said, "All right. We'll deal with arrangements tomorrow." That was it. I waited because I thought maybe something else would come after that. A question. A shift in his voice. Some sign that he understood I had been sitting alone in a surgical waiting room for hours. Nothing came. So I asked him, "Is that all you have to say?" He sounded irritated now, as if I were dragging out a practical conversation. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "She's gone." I said I wanted him to say he was sorry he hadn't come. I wanted him to ask if I was all right. He gave a short breath into the phone. "You work around this stuff," he said. "You know how it is." Then he hung up. I looked at the call duration on the screen before it disappeared. Less than a minute. After that, I called my mother. I could hear a television in the background when she picked up. I told her my grandmother was gone. She was quiet for a second and then said, in a flat voice, that maybe it was for the best. I remember gripping the phone harder at that. Not because I wanted to argue, more because it felt like I needed to hold on to something solid. I asked if she was coming to the hospital. She said, "What for?" "She's already gone, isn't she?" Then she told me my father would handle everything in the morning. She ended the call before I did. I sat on a bench by the elevators for another 20 minutes after that. Nurses moved past me in soft shoes. A janitor emptied a trash can nearby. My coffee cup, long empty by then, had gone cold in my hand. I did not cry in the hospital. I drove home through almost no traffic, parked in front of my apartment, and went inside. I put my bag on the kitchen chair, took off my badge, and laid my phone on the table. Then I opened the Notes app and started making a list. Call from hospital. Calls to my parents. Group message. Read receipts. Father's text. Surgery start time. Time of death. Phone calls after. I was not planning anything yet. Not really. I was just putting the night in order because if I did not, it was going to sit in my body in pieces. The next morning, my father called at 9. His tone was brisk, as if we were discussing a repair appointment or tax paperwork. He said he had selected a funeral home and that since I was off work, I could handle the meeting and the coordination. I told him I was not off work. I had taken emergency leave. He said, "You're a nurse. You know how all this works." I stood at the sink while he talked and looked out at the frost still clinging to the cars parked along the curb. "I'm a hospice nurse," I said. "That's not the same thing." He sighed through his nose, tired already with me. "Just do it," he said. "We trust you." That was the word he used. Trust. I wrote down the name of the funeral home and the appointment time on the back of an unopened electric bill. Then I showered, dressed, and drove across town under a low white sky. The funeral director met me in a quiet office with beige walls, two framed prints of winter trees, and a box of tissues placed where everyone could see them without having to ask. He was kind in a professional way, slowed his voice, gave me space to answer questions. As we went through the forms, he asked whether my parents would be involved in making decisions. I paused longer than I meant to. Then I said, my father asked me to handle it. The funeral director nodded once, like he had heard versions of that answer before. Near the end of the meeting, he opened a folder and mentioned that my grandmother had come in recently to prearrange several things herself. She had chosen hymns. She had made notes about readings. She had left instructions. And, he added carefully, she had also left sealed materials with a pastor and an attorney to be opened under certain circumstances. I looked up from the form in front of me. What kind of materials? He said he did not know, only that she had been very clear about the conditions. That was the first moment something in the story shifted for me. Until then, I had been thinking only about the hospital, the waiting room, my father's text, the calls, the absence. But hearing that she had prepared something ahead of time changed the shape of it. It meant she had expected something, or someone. I left the funeral home with a folder under my arm and drove to my grandmother's house to look for clothes for the service. It was a narrow brick house on a quiet street, the kind with small front steps and lace curtains that stayed up year-round. Her porch still had the winter mat out, the one with a faded blue border. Inside, the house smelled like lemon polish, old books, and the faint lavender hand cream she always used. Everything was in its place. Afghans folded over the sofa, mail stacked in a tray, a ceramic bowl by the door for keys she no longer drove with very often. The quiet there was different from the hospital quiet. Softer, personal. I went to her bedroom first, opened the closet, and stood for a minute looking at her clothes on their hangers. Wool cardigans, church dresses and garment bags, a navy coat with gloves tucked into one pocket. I chose a blouse and skirt I knew she liked, then carried them to the kitchen table to fold them neatly into the garment bag I had brought. That was when I saw the envelope. It was lying in the middle of the table, placed carefully, not tucked away. My name was written on the front in her handwriting. No flourish, just steady blue ink. I set the clothes down and pulled out a chair. For a few seconds, I only looked at it. Then I turned it over and saw a date written in the corner from 6 days earlier. I slid one finger under the flap and opened it at the table where she used to drink tea in the afternoons, with the yellow light over the stove on and the radio turned low. Inside was a letter, and underneath it, a smaller stack of photocopied documents. I unfolded the first page and began to read. Then I stopped. I read the first page once, then I went back to the top and read it again more slowly. My grandmother wrote in a plain, steady hand. No flourish. No wasted words. She said that if I was opening the envelope, she was gone, and there were things I needed to understand while they were still clear. She wrote that she had arranged for the hospital to contact me first if anything became critical. She said she had done that on purpose. Then she wrote something that made me put the page down for a moment. She said she never expected my father to come. Not because he was busy. Not because he was overwhelmed. Because, in her words, he had shown her many times who he was, and she had finally decided to believe him. I sat back in the kitchen chair and looked out at the dark yard through the window over the sink. The late afternoon light had gone dim by then, and the glass reflected part of the room back at me. The overhead fixture buzzed softly. Somewhere in the house, the heat kicked on. Then I picked up the letter again. She wrote that after her stroke years earlier, she had spent weeks in rehab learning to walk again. During that time, she said, my father had visited once. Just once. She had kept the visitor record from the facility. It was in the envelope with the letter. I moved the page aside and looked at the copies beneath it. There it was. Facility name at the top. Her admission dates. A list of visitors. My name appeared again and again over the course of several weeks. My father's name appeared one time. A single entry. Mid-morning. 15 minutes. My mother's name did not appear at all. I stared at that page longer than I needed to. Not because it was hard to understand. because it was so easy to understand. I had not known. Back then, my father had told me she was improving, that things were being handled, that I did not need to worry. I had believed him because it never occurred to me to ask for a log. It never occurred to me that someone could reduce care to appearances and still feel entitled to the story afterward. I kept going through the envelope. There were photocopies of bank statements with yellow marks beside certain withdrawals. Notes in the margins in my grandmother's handwriting. Dates. Amounts. Short descriptions. One entry from a few years earlier showed a withdrawal in the low thousands. Next to it, she had written that my father asked for help with repairs and said he would repay her quickly. Another showed a second amount tied to car trouble. Same promise. No repayment marked anywhere. Under the bank statements was a small USB drive in a plastic sleeve. I turned it over in my hand for a second, then found my laptop bag in the hall and brought it into the kitchen. The metal chair legs made a dry scraping sound against the floor. I sat down again, plugged the drive in, and opened the files. There were audio recordings. Voicemails. The first one was from years back, 2 days after her stroke. My father's voice came through casual and familiar, almost cheerful. He did not ask how she was feeling. He did not ask whether therapy was going well. He asked whether she had thought any more about selling the house. I let the message play all the way through. Then I played the next one. That one mentioned a realtor. The third one asked for money. Then another. Then another. Same tone. Same rhythm. A kind of practiced ease that sounded normal until you listened to what it was actually saying. By the time I finished, it was fully dark outside. The kitchen had gone cold enough that I put on my coat again, even though I was still sitting at the table. The laptop screen lit up the papers in front of me. My grandmother's writing, the highlighted statements, the copied logs, the small pile of evidence she had built quietly over time. That was when I understood that she had not left me keepsakes. She had left me a record. And whether she meant to or not, she had shown me exactly what to do next. I got up, found a legal pad in the junk drawer beside the refrigerator, and came back to the table. I wrote the date across the top. Then I started organizing everything the only way I knew how. Timeline, names, documents, supporting record. I did not write in paragraphs. I wrote in categories. Hospital absence, prior neglect, financial requests, promises made, promises broken, written instructions. That was the first real shift. Until then, I had been moving through grief the way most people do, one practical task at a time, trying to stay upright long enough to handle whatever was directly in front of me. But sitting there with those papers, I felt something calmer settle in. Not relief. Not anger either. Just clarity. I worked in hospice. I spent my days documenting symptoms, conversations, family meetings, consent, refusals, timelines, changes in condition. I knew what mattered when memory and emotion started competing with fact. Dates mattered. Language mattered. Who showed up mattered. I looked over at my phone on the table and opened the messages from the night of the surgery. The read receipts were still there. Times attached to each one. My father's text exactly as he had sent it. I took screenshots and sent them to myself. Then I checked my call history and saved that too. After that, I made a second page on the pad and gave it a heading. What can be verified under that? I listed it out. Hospital contact and surgery timeline. My calls and texts to both parents. Their read receipts and responses. Visitor record from the hospital. Earlier rehab visitor log. Bank statements and voicemail dates. Any written instruction she left with third parties. Seeing it arranged that way changed the emotional temperature of the whole thing. There was no need to argue with anyone. No need to predict what my father might say. No need to defend my version of events. The facts were already doing the work. I stayed at the table for another hour, maybe more, building out the sequence as carefully as if I were preparing a patient chart for review. At some point I made tea and forgot to drink it. At some point my phone lit up with a message from a cousin asking about service details, and I answered in 2 sentences, then put the phone face down again. Before I left the house that night, I went through the envelope one more time to make sure I had not missed anything. At the very bottom was a short note in my grandmother's hand. Just one line, almost added as an afterthought. It said there were additional sealed instructions with her pastor and her attorney, and that those would explain the rest. I folded the note carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I gathered the copies, the USB drive, my legal pad, and the folder from the funeral home. I stacked them neatly, tied them with one of the elastic bands from her kitchen drawer, and carried them to my car. The air outside had gone sharp and cold. My breath fogged in front of me as I locked the front door. The street was quiet. One porch light down the block flickered against the siding of the neighboring house. I put everything on the passenger seat beside me and sat there with both hands on the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. I was no longer just grieving. I was preparing. Over the next few days, I stopped trying to make sense of my parents and started working from a simpler question. What could be proved? That became the rule. I went back to the hospital and requested the visitor information from the night of the surgery. I did it the same way I would have done it for any family trying to understand a timeline after a death. Calm voice. Specific dates. Exact window of time. The clerk printed the record and slid it across the counter. One visitor. My name. Badge number. Entry time. Exit time. No one else. I folded that page once and placed it in a manila folder. Then I drove to a copy shop and made duplicates of everything I had gathered so far. One set for me. One set to keep untouched. One set in case I needed to hand it to someone without hesitation. That was step 1. Build the record. Step 2 was to identify who already had pieces of it. My grandmother's note had mentioned 2 people by name, her pastor and her attorney. So I called both offices. I did not tell either of them much on the phone. Just that my grandmother had passed, that I had been told she left materials behind, and that I was following her instructions. The attorney's office asked me to come in the following week. The church secretary told me Pastor Michael had set aside time before the funeral and could speak with me briefly afterward if needed. Neither call was emotional. That helped. Emotion invites opinion. Procedure keeps things in place. At night, I kept working at my kitchen table. I spread the papers out in a careful row and built a cleaner timeline on my laptop. Not just what happened the night my grandmother died, but the larger pattern around it. Her stroke and rehab. My father's single visit. The money requests. The notes beside the withdrawals. The monthly voicemails. The hospital contact instructions. The missed calls and read messages during surgery. His text. The more I arranged it, the less chaotic it looked. It was not random cruelty. It was a system. Minimal contact. Selective involvement. Practical interest whenever money, property, or image was involved. Absence when care was required. I did not need to name it anything larger than that. I just needed to keep it accurate. The funeral was held the following week at a Catholic church my grandmother had attended for years. I arrived early because I wanted a few quiet minutes before anyone else came in. The church smelled faintly of candle wax and old wood. Morning light came through the stained glass windows in long metered bands, falling across the pews in blue and red. Somewhere near the front, someone was adjusting flowers in a metal stand, and I could hear the soft rustle of tissue paper around the stems. I signed the register, then sat 3 rows back on the left side. My parents arrived later than I expected. My mother was wearing a dark coat with a pearl pin near the collar. My father had the same expression I had seen at formal family events for years: controlled, public, ready. He touched people on the arm when they spoke to him. He lowered his head at the right moments. He accepted condolences with the tone of someone who understood how to be observed. I watched him do all of it without moving. Then I looked away. The service began. The priest spoke about my grandmother's steadiness, her faith, her garden, the meals she brought people after surgeries and baptisms and difficult winters. Most of it was true. Some of it was incomplete. That happens at funerals. People summarize a life in the ways that are easiest to say out loud. I kept my hands folded in my lap and listened. Near the end, after the formal remarks should have been finished, Pastor Michael stepped back to the lectern and paused. He held a sealed envelope in one hand. The room grew still in that particular way rooms do when no one knows yet that something has changed. He said my grandmother had left written instructions to be followed only if certain people were present. Then he looked directly toward the front pew where my father was seated. He said the envelope was not to be read aloud if John was in attendance. It was to be handed privately to me. The words were simple. The effect was not. My father turned halfway in the pew. My mother looked up sharply. I felt every head in the church shift a fraction, not enough to be obvious, just enough to register. Pastor Michael walked down the aisle and placed the envelope in my hand. My father stood up. He said it was his mother, that he had a right to know what was in it. Pastor Michael answered in the same calm tone he had used the entire service. He said my grandmother's wishes were clear and that this was how they would be honored. There was no debate after that because he did not leave room for one. My father sat back down, but not quietly. I did not open the envelope there. Instead, I stood, stepped out through the side aisle, and walked to the small restroom off the vestibule. The tile floor was cool under my shoes. Someone had left a hand towel slightly crooked by the sink. I locked the door, leaned the envelope against the counter, and opened it carefully along the top. Inside was another letter. This one was more direct than the first. My grandmother wrote that if I was reading it, my father had chosen to appear where he could be seen, which told me everything she expected it would. She repeated the details she had documented, the single rehab visit, the financial requests, the timed calls, the house. She wrote that she had made her decisions clearly and legally. She wrote that copies of her current will were already with both the pastor and her attorney. Then, near the end, she wrote something I read twice. She said he would likely claim she had been confused, manipulated, pressured, or frightened into changing anything that affected property. She told me not to argue with him when that happened. She told me to rely on records, witnesses, and process, not emotion. That line stayed with me. I folded the letter and put it back into the envelope. Then I stood there for a minute in the quiet restroom with the paper in my hand and felt the entire situation settle into focus. My grandmother had already anticipated the challenge. She had already set the rules. All I had to do was follow them. When I came back into the church, the service was ending. People were standing. Coats were being gathered. My father looked at me immediately, but I did not stop near his pew. I walked past him, past the side altar, and out to the front steps where the air felt colder than before. At the house afterward, there was the usual gathering. Relatives in the living room with paper plates. Neighbors in the kitchen speaking softly. Coats draped over dining chairs. The smell of coffee and baked pasta and wet wool. I stayed near the fireplace for a while, speaking when spoken to, accepting condolences, answering practical questions. I noticed my father moving through the room in short, restless paths. He was waiting for a moment to get me alone. I could tell by the way he kept looking over. I did not give him one. That was another rule. Silence can be useful when the other person needs access more than you do. Eventually, the room thinned slightly. People settled into clusters. My father approached and asked, in a low voice, what had been in the envelope. I told him it was private. He said nothing his mother left should be kept from him. I looked at him for a second and then answered as evenly as I could. She made her wishes clear. His jaw tightened. He said she had not been herself toward the end, that older people got confused, that outside influence mattered more than people realized. There it was. Not even an hour later. Exactly what she had predicted. I did not argue. I did not remind him of the hospital. I did not mention the text. I did not say anything about the years before it. I only said, then you can discuss that with her attorney. For the first time that day, he had no immediate reply. He stared at me, waiting for more. I gave him nothing. Then I turned and walked into the kitchen, where the kettle was beginning to whistle on the stove. A few minutes later, while I was pouring hot water into a mug I did not really want, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a voicemail notification from a number I did not recognize. The transcript preview showed the attorney's office. I stepped into the back hallway to listen to the message. The attorney said there were materials my grandmother had left on file that I needed to review in person. His tone was measured. Not urgent exactly, but firm enough that I knew this was not routine estate paperwork. I put the phone away and went back into the kitchen. The kettle had gone quiet by then. Steam still lifted from the mug on the counter. Two of my aunts were speaking softly near the table, and someone in the next room laughed too loudly at something that was not funny enough to deserve it. That is another thing funerals do. They force ordinary sounds into the middle of grief. I stood there for a second, one hand around the mug, and decided I was done letting the day push me around. So I moved it into order. First, I found Pastor Michael near the dining room doorway and asked whether he had a few minutes before he left. He said yes. Then I asked one of my cousins to stay in the living room with us for a moment because I wanted a witness. She looked surprised, but she agreed. Then I asked my father to sit down. Not sharply, just plainly. He hesitated, but he did it. My mother sat beside him without being asked. Pastor Michael took the armchair near the mantel. My cousin stood by the bookshelf with her coat still on. The room got quieter. Not completely. People were still in the kitchen and hallway. Plates still moved. A faucet ran. But close around us, there was a pause. I stayed standing. "I'm going to keep this simple," I said. My father folded his hands and gave me a look that was meant to suggest patience. I took the folded letter from my bag, but I did not hand it to him. "Grandma left written instructions," I said. "Copies of her final decisions are with her attorney and with Pastor Michael. I've been told the process is already in motion." My father asked what decisions. I answered him directly. Her estate plan. Her contact instructions. Everything connected to her medical wishes and the house. My mother's eyes shifted to my face, then to the letter in my hand. My father leaned back and said, "Well, I'd like to see whatever she signed, because I don't believe she would have done anything unusual without discussing it with family." I noticed the wording. Not with me. With family. As if he still expected to define the room. I said, "You can request anything you're entitled to through the attorney." He gave a short, humorless smile. "Entitled to," he repeated. "Maria, let's not turn this into something legal." "It already is legal," I said. That was the first line that changed him. His shoulders tightened. His voice stayed level, but only just. "So, what exactly are you implying?" "Nothing," I said. "I'm telling you how this will work." No one moved. Pastor Michael remained very still in the chair, hands folded over one knee. My cousin looked down at the rug and then back up again. My mother had gone pale around the mouth. My father asked me if I had been influencing my grandmother in her final weeks. He asked it in the tone people use when they are pretending to be careful but have already chosen their accusation. I did not answer the accusation. I answered the structure. "She updated things while competent," I said. "There are witnesses." He opened his mouth, but I continued before he could build momentum. "She also left written confirmation about who was to be contacted in a medical emergency." The hospital followed those instructions. That landed harder than I expected. Because until then, I do not think either of them understood that my grandmother had formally removed them from that part of her life. My mother spoke first. "She told them not to call us?" I turned to her and said, "Yes." It was the first truthful answer she had received from me all week that I did not soften. My father sat forward. "That doesn't sound like her." "No," I said. "It sounds exactly like her." He stood up then, not violently, but too fast. The edge of his knee hit the coffee table and rattled a plate someone had left there earlier. My cousin stepped back. Pastor Michael did not. My father said he was not going to stand in his own mother's house and be spoken to like a criminal. I said, "Then don't make this harder than it needs to be." That was all. No speech. No raised voice. No list of old grievances. I did not need any of that. He looked around the room, maybe expecting someone to pull it back into polite family vagueness for him. No one did. My mother stood too, but more slowly. She smoothed her coat with both hands, a small anxious gesture I had seen my whole life. Then she asked, very quietly, "Did she really leave instructions about the house?" I said yes. My father turned toward her immediately. "Don't," he said. But she was looking at me, not him. "Did she leave it to you?" she asked. I held her gaze for a second and then said, "That's what I've been told." There was a small sound from the kitchen doorway behind us, someone realizing they had walked into the wrong moment. Then footsteps retreated. My father picked up his coat from the arm of the sofa. "This is not over," he said. I believed him, but I did not let that show. "I know," I said. Then I stepped aside to give him a clear path to the front door. He left first. My mother followed after a delay of maybe 3 seconds, enough time to look back at me once without saying anything. The front door closed. The house settled around the sound. No one in the room spoke right away. Then Pastor Michael stood and said, in the same steady tone he had used all day, "You handled that properly." I nodded. He touched my arm once before leaving for the hall. After that, the gathering dissolved quickly. People knew when the center of a room had shifted and when it was time to go home. Coats came off chairs. Goodbyes were lowered into careful, practical voices. Leftovers were covered. My cousin hugged me at the door and whispered that she was sorry. I thanked her and closed the door behind the last guest. Then the house was quiet. I walked back into the living room and began straightening things because I needed the visible order. Stacked cups, folded napkins, moved chairs back where they belonged, gathered empty plates into the kitchen sink. That kind of work helps. You move objects. You restore shape. You let your hands do something useful while your mind catches up. When I finally sat down at the kitchen table, it was almost dark outside. The overhead light cast a yellow circle over the wood grain and the stack of folders beside me. I took out the attorney's voicemail again and wrote down the office address and appointment time on the top sheet of my notepad. The next morning, I drove downtown under a low winter sky and met with him in a quiet office with leather chairs, 2 framed diplomas, and a wall clock that ticked just loud enough to notice. He had already placed a file on the desk before I sat down. He opened it, adjusted his glasses, and began laying things out one at a time. My grandmother's final will. Witness signatures. A written statement affirming she was acting freely. A copy of her medical contact instructions. And then, near the bottom of the file, another sealed envelope he said she had directed him to give me only after the funeral. I looked at the envelope for a second, but did not open it yet. The attorney folded his hands and said, "Before you read that, there's something else you need to know." Then he told me my father had already contacted his office. The attorney told me my father had called 2 days earlier. Not to ask for copies. Not to ask how the estate process worked. He had called to suggest there might be concerns about my grandmother's state of mind in her final weeks and to say, in a careful way, that I had been spending too much time around her near the end. The attorney said this without emphasis. He did not need any. I sat very still in the chair across from his desk and asked what he had told him. He said he had told my father the same thing he would tell anyone. If there was a legal concern, it could be addressed through proper channels. Until then, the file would be handled according to my grandmother's written instructions. Then he slid one more document across the desk. It was a signed statement from my grandmother, dated a week before the surgery. In it, she said clearly that any updates to her estate documents were made by her choice, without pressure and with full understanding of what she was doing. It was witnessed. It was notarized. It was exact. I read it once and set it down. Then I opened the envelope he had given me. Inside was a short note from my grandmother and a flash drive. The note was brief. She wrote that if I was reading it, the funeral was over and people had begun saying whatever they were going to say. She told me the drive contained something she wanted preserved with the rest of the record. She wrote that I would know when to use it. I took the drive home and waited until evening to open it. By then my apartment was quiet. The radiator clicked on and off. A lamp near the sofa lit only half the room. I made tea, set it on the coffee table, and plugged the drive into my laptop. There was one video file. It opened to my grandmother sitting in her living room, upright in her armchair, hands folded in her lap. She was wearing her glasses and a light cardigan I had seen her in 100 times. She looked directly into the camera and stated her name, the date, and why she had decided to record herself. Her voice was steady. She said she was making the video because she wanted a record in her own words while no one could claim confusion later. She spoke about my father plainly, not cruelly. Just plainly. She said he had reduced contact over the years to brief calls, requests, and appearances when something practical was involved. She mentioned the stroke, the single rehab visit, the money, the house. She said she had timed the calls because she wanted to stop questioning her own memory. Then she said she was leaving her home and assets to me because I was the one who stayed. Not because I had asked. Because I had not. I watched the whole recording through once without moving. Then I played it again and took notes. Date stated on camera. Full name. Purpose of recording. Specific references to prior records. Clear statement of intent. Capacity. No hesitation in speech. No confusion. No wandering. No one else in frame. No prompts. The video was not emotional in the way people usually mean that word. It was careful. It matched everything else she had left behind. And because it matched, it mattered. A few days later, my father filed a formal challenge. It alleged undue influence, suggested mental decline, implied that the changes to the will were not natural and had occurred because I was close to my grandmother at the end. I was not surprised. By then, the pattern had become almost predictable. When care was required, he disappeared. When records appeared, he objected. When process took over, he tried to recast himself as the injured party. The attorney handled the filings. I did not have to speak publicly about any of it right away. Mostly, I kept working, kept documenting, and kept answering only what needed to be answered. More supporting material came in through that process. A physician statement confirming my grandmother had been fully alert and competent when discussing her care directives. Witness confirmation tied to the will. Copies of the notarized documents. Visitor records. Financial records. The voicemail files. Then, unexpectedly, one more piece. A notary contacted the attorney's office and said my father had approached her after the funeral with an older document he claimed reflected my grandmother's true intentions. He wanted it treated as valid despite obvious problems with the signatures and witnessing. She refused. The signature, she said, did not match the recent documents she had actually handled for my grandmother. That did not become some dramatic scene. It became an affidavit. And affidavits are much harder to argue with. The hearing took place in early spring. I wore a navy suit, carried a folder I did not open, and sat quietly behind the attorney while the court worked through the file. The room was plain in the way most courtrooms are plain. Would trim, fluorescent light. A clock no one looked at directly. My father sat at the other table with a expression that seemed built more for appearances than endurance. He looked at me once when I came in. I nodded once in acknowledgement and sat down. That was all. The attorney presented the record in order. Updated will. Witnesses. Medical directives. Written statement of competency. Video recording. Visitor logs. Financial documentation. Voicemail history. The challenge itself did not hold up well once it had to sit next to the dates. That was the thing I kept learning over and over through the whole process. Stories can stay vague for years inside a family. Dates make them choose a shape. The judge asked a few questions. My father's side tried to suggest isolation, confusion, emotional dependence, pressure. But every time they tried to widen the frame, the documents brought it back down to specifics. A signed statement, a timed visit, a bank withdrawal with a note, a message with a timestamp, a direct instruction, a witness. By the end, the result felt less like a victory than an arrival. The court upheld my grandmother's final documents. The challenge was dismissed. Her wishes stood. There was no dramatic outburst, no speech, no last-minute confession in the hallway. My father gathered his papers too quickly, spoke to no one, and left through the side door with his attorney a few steps behind him. I stayed seated for a moment after the room emptied. My own attorney closed the file and said, quietly, she prepared well. I said yes. She did. Outside, the weather had shifted towards spring, but had not committed to it yet. The air was cool, the pavement still damp from earlier rain. I stood on the courthouse steps with the folder under my arm and watched traffic move past for a minute without trying to think ahead. Later that week, the house transferred fully according to the estate plan. Title: Accounts. Inventory. Everything followed the same path her paperwork had already laid out. My mother called once after that. Her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. She said she knew things had gone too far. She said she had told herself certain stories because it was easier than interrupting what my father wanted. She did not ask for forgiveness in so many words, but the shape of the call leaned that way. I listened. Then I told her I was not ready to discuss anything beyond practical matters. She accepted that more quickly than I expected. That was the closest thing to redemption the situation offered. Not repair, just acknowledgement and a boundary. By early summer, I had keys to the house in my own hand and a final court order in the folder with the rest of the documents. I took both into the front room one evening, set them on the coffee table, and stood there looking at the furniture in the fading light. Nothing in the room had changed, and yet everything had. I went to the kitchen, opened the drawer where my grandmother kept rubber bands and pens, and found the same kind of legal pad I had used weeks earlier at my own table. I tore off a page and wrote 3 things on it: utilities, locks, files. Then I set the page beside the keys and listened to the quiet in the house. For the first time since the hospital, it felt settled. I moved into the house slowly. Not all at once. Not with boxes stacked everywhere and music playing and people carrying lamps through the front door. I did it room by room, drawer by drawer, the way you move through a place that has already held a full life and does not need to be rushed into another one. The first weekend, I brought over my coffee maker, 2 mugs, clean sheets, and a box of work clothes. I changed the locks. I set the utility accounts in order. I labeled a file drawer in the hall cabinet for the estate records and placed every document inside in the same sequence the attorney had used: will, medical instructions, visitor logs, bank statements, affidavits, court order, video inventory. Once they were filed, I closed the drawer and let it stay closed. That mattered to me. I did not want the story of what happened living loose on countertops and in bags and between books. I wanted it contained. Preserved, but contained. By the end of the second week, I had cleared one shelf in the living room for the things I actually wanted to see: a framed photo of my grandmother in her garden, the little brass clock she kept by the radio, a small ceramic bowl she used for lemon candies, things that belonged to her life, not to the case that had followed her death. In the mornings, I started waking earlier than I needed to. The house caught light differently than my apartment had. It came in softer through the front windows and settled over the wood floors in long pale rectangles. I would make coffee in the kitchen, stand at the sink, and look out into the yard while the kettle clicked itself cool beside me. Those mornings became a kind of reset. Quiet. Ordered. Mine. A few people from church checked in during that time. One neighbor brought over a loaf of bread wrapped in a dish towel. Pastor Michael stopped by once with a folder of service notes and ended up staying only 10 minutes, which I appreciated. He understood that care does not always mean lingering. At work, I went back to my normal schedule. Hospice has a way of returning you to proportion. Medications still need to be counted. Families still need updates. Blankets still need adjusting. New admissions arrive with their own histories, their own silences, their own one person who always shows up and the other person who says they will come later and often does not. I noticed those patterns more quickly after my grandmother died. Not with suspicion, just with recognition. If someone had no visitors for 3 days, I noticed. If the calls only came when property or paperwork was mentioned, I noticed. If a patient kept defending someone who had not been there once, I noticed that too. I did not tell every family my story. Most of the time that would have been the wrong thing. But once in a while, when the moment called for it, I would say something simple. I would ask whether the patient had updated their directives. I would ask whether their wishes were written down clearly. I would ask who they wanted called first and whether that matched who usually showed up. Those were practical questions. But they were also, in their own way, acts of protection. A few months after I moved in, I found one of my grandmother's gardening gloves tucked behind a flower pot in the shed. Soil still clung to the fingertips. I set it on the back steps while I cleared weeds from the side bed and planted something new there. Nothing elaborate. Just yellow flowers because she liked them and because they made the yard look lived in again. That afternoon, I came inside through the kitchen door with dirt on my hands and the screen slapping shut behind me, and for the first time in a long while, the house did not feel like the site of a legal fight or a family fracture. It felt like a home that had survived both. My mother called again once near the end of summer. The conversation was shorter than the first one. Softer too. She told me she had moved into a smaller place. She said she had started volunteering 2 days a week at a parish pantry. She did not offer that information as proof of anything, just as fact. I listened, and when there was a pause, I told her I was glad she had somewhere stable to be. That was as far as it went. It was enough for that day. Some relationships do not heal all at once. Some never return to what they were. Sometimes the most honest version of peace is a maintained distance with a little less bitterness in it. I could live with that. One evening in February, almost a year after the funeral, I sat at the same kitchen table where I had first opened my grandmother's envelope. I had a mug in my hand and a load of laundry turning in the next room. The house was quiet except for the soft, mechanical sound of the dryer and the occasional passing car outside. I looked around and noticed how ordinary everything had become. The folded dish towel by the stove, my work bag hanging from the chair, mail stacked neatly by the fruit bowl, a lamp left on in the front room. That ordinary feeling was what I had wanted all along. Not victory, not vindication, just a life that had been put back into order. Before bed, I walked through the house the way my grandmother used to, checked the back door, turned off the lamp in the hallway, straightened a cushion, paused in the living room for a moment in the dim light. Then I went to the file drawer, opened it once, and looked at the labels inside. Everything was there. Everything in its place. I closed the drawer and went to bed. A week later, one of our social workers at hospice asked if I had a minute after shift because there was a new patient whose nephew had suddenly become very interested in helping now that the doctors were talking about decline. She said the patient seemed uneasy but was minimizing it. I told her I had a minute. Then I sat down. There is always another family somewhere trying to decide what love looks like when time is short. There is always someone older trying to make their wishes clear before other voices get louder than theirs. And there is almost always one quiet person in the room who has been doing the real showing up all along. I pay attention to that person now. Maybe more than I used to. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. I hope it gave you something steady to hold on to. If it did, please like and subscribe. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment with the city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always like seeing where people are listening from. 2 popular stories will appear next, and I think you'll want to hear those too.